In the last hour, Armenian PM Sarkisian resigns. Thousands celebrate in Yerevan. Sometimes Armenian protests are just Armenian protests. In the last 2 hours, Armenian premier steps down after 11 days of protests. Armenia, after protests, Prime Minister to step down. ANCA-Western region congratulates the Armenian people on peaceful victory. Earlier today, Armenians deliver a blow to Putin's political model. Armenian Prime Minister resigns after mass protests. Video. Armenian Prime Minister resigns after mass protests in the last 6 hours. Canada applauds courage of Armenian protesters. Armenia, Sarkisian resignation a blow to Russia. Foreign policy in the last 8 hours. Armenia's leader quits amid protests. Armenia PM resigns after protests. Armenian Prime Minister resigns after 6 days in office. Armenia PM resigns after days of mass protests. Police in Armenia detain opposition leaders. Protesters. Armenia's Prime Minister steps down amid protests. Armenia's leader quits amid protests, saying, "I was wrong. Armenia's peaceful revolution is a lesson for Putin." Armenian PM resigns. In face of protests, Armenia's leader resigns amid peaceful mass protests. Yesterday, U.S. ready to work with new Armenian government. Pashinyan calls for prime minister elections in 1 week. Pashinyan, reaction of Russian Foreign Ministry representative is important. Armenia's president accepts government resignation. All Armenian protests achieved resignation of prime minister amid protests. Armenia's prime minister and former president will resign. Armenian opposition leader says will hold talks with acting PM on Wednesday. Armenians vent anger at authorities in victory for civil society. What's next for Armenia following a government reshuffle? Armenia's Velvet Revolution, sold leader ends 10-year rule after soldiers join protesters. Armenian opposition leader, snap parliamentary elections are needed. I was wrong. Armenian leader resigns unexpectedly. Sarkisian resigns as Armenian PM. Armenian leader resigns in wake of protests. Armenia's prime minister resigns. Sit-ins and picket lines. Why Armenia has been protesting. Video explainer. Armenian PM resigns. Here's what led to the surprise move. President Armen Sarkisian receives U.S. Ambassador. Armenian leader Serge Sarkisian resigns after 11 days of protests. Armenian president accepts resignation of government. Armenian government resigns. Armenian president Armen Sarkisian reappoints 4 ministers. Serge Sarkisian's statement of resignation. English translation. RL journalists assaulted in Armenia. Armenia's prime minister resigns after more than a week of protests. Armenian president reappoints another 4 ministers. How 11 days of protests brought down Armenia's leader Serge Sarkisian. Armenian PM Sarkisian quits after 11 days of street protests. What's going on in Armenia? Protesters declare victory. Protests in Armenia unlikely to change the country's foreign policy. Karen Karapetyan to fulfill Armenian prime minister's duties. Why Armenians call for a velvet revolution. Moscow reacts to resignation of Armenian PM Sarkisian. I was wrong. Armenia's Prime Minister Sarkisian resigns amid mass rallies. Armenian Premier resigns amid protests. Armenia Prime Minister resigns after 6 days in office. Armenian PM quits after nearly 2 weeks of street protests. OSCEPA, we stand ready to support Armenia on its democratic path. Armenian President reappoints cabinet ministers. Velvet revolution is success. Sarkisian resigns. Pashinyan, proud Armenian citizen, you won. Putin's tactics at play in Armenia. Armenian leader, facing mass protests, resigns. Serge Sarkisian resigns as Armenia's PM after protests. Armenian Prime Minister Sarkisian resigns in face of protests. Armenia's Sarkisian quits as Prime Minister after mass protest celebrations in Yerevan as Sarkisian resigns. Armenian opposition leader Pashinyan rejoins protests.